Hi everyone. It's really good to see all of you back. Welcome to the Democracy Dialogues. Some of you might know me. My name is Victoria Guquetz, and I've been hosting the Democracy Dialogues for a little while now. So for those of you who have participated in past sessions, welcome back. I hope you had a great summer. And for anyone who's newly joining us, thanks for being here. The team and I have programmed an important discussion for all of us to engage in that we feel speaks to some of the critical questions of the day. Here at the Exchange, we aim to be timely, responsive, and engage those who are advancing democracy at all levels across Canada. So I'm hoping you'll actively participate. We'll have a Q&A session at the end, and I look forward to your comments in the chat box along the way. But first, I'd love to have all of you introduce yourselves to me and to one another as well. So if you can please use the chat function to share your names and which organizations you're joining from, that would be great. Thank you. So today we're actually going to dive into the concept of digital democracy and citizen empowerment. For those of you who've been following along with us this season, we've held dialogues that look at the negative impacts of social media and more broadly of online hate and of polarization, among other themes. But today we actually want to look at the flip side a little bit. So we'll ask questions like, how can we leverage digital to empower people's voices? And how can we use the internet to earn back faith in democracy and trust in government? We'll look at some of the tools and platforms that have done and continue to do this work. And we'll investigate the positive potential of the internet to crowdsource and address public policy challenges and amplify advocacy and activism. But before we get going, I'd love to throw up a few poll questions to see what all of you are thinking and what you're bringing to this conversation today. And Ashley is actually going to help me with that. Thank you, Ashley. Do you mind putting up the poll questions? So the first one is, do you think the positive potential of digital democracy outweighs the potential for democratic erosion online? Okay, so far we have a bit of a split. Now, yeah, we're basically at 50-50 or a little bit. Let's see where it ends up going. Okay, so we seem to have a pretty, people feeling different opinions, which is a good thing, but we want that, pluralism of perspective here. And then we have one more, another question that we have. Ashley, can you share the second one, please? Great. So the other one is, have you personally used the internet to join in democratic civic engagement or activism? Okay, so this one's a little bit less divided. We have 82% so far who say that yes, they do that daily, and about 15% who don't. Okay, so thank you for that. We're going to bear that in mind as we keep going through the conversation. So as I'm sure you saw on the registration, we've invited some deep thinkers and doers who are creating and researching these pathways, and I'm excited to welcome them in a moment. But first, I want to offer a land acknowledgement. Today, we're meeting virtually, so you may not be on the same ground as me. I'm currently in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and Mississaugas of the New Credit Territory. So instead, please join me in acknowledging the Indigenous people of all the lands that we're on today to reflect on the importance of those lands. Together, we must continuously work hard to understand the long histories of the lands and recognize what those histories mean for the work of truth and reconciliation ahead of our shared work around democratic engagement in our communities and the ecosystem we operate in. I encourage you all to take the time to think about the lands you call home and what you're personally doing to advance reconciliation in Canada. And given that we're soon entering Truth and Reconciliation Week, and that September 30th is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, I'd like to express my solidarity and the solidarity of the entire Exchange team by wearing orange today. I don't know if you can see it as much as I hoped, but as many of you will know, the day honors the children who never returned home and the survivors of residential schools, as well as their families and communities. Public commemoration such as this of the tragic and painful history and ongoing impacts is a vital component of the reconciliation process, and we want to do our part in promoting the concept that every child matters. So if you have any events or learnings that you're taking part in to deepen your knowledge and understanding, please share them in the chat so that we can all learn. So thank you for that. And with that in mind, I'd like to welcome our guests. So today we're welcoming John Richardson, who's the CEO of Othello, and Dr. Amanda Clark of Carleton University. So a warm welcome to our guests today. Thank you so much for being here, John and Amanda. How are you?
Good, thank you. Pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you. And how are you, Amanda?
I'm good, yes. Thanks for having me.
Is it a colder day in Ottawa today, or how's you have to
No,
be
it's really
Canadian and talk
beautiful.
about the weather?
Yeah, well, it's a thing. But no, it's beautiful. It's that time of year. It's like September is the nicest time in Ottawa, I think.
Agreed. And John, I forgot to ask you where you're phoning in from today.
I'm in Vancouver.
Oh, lovely. So I assume the weather is it's very nice.
That's nice. But apparently it's going to rain today, and then it's going to rain for another 6 months. So don't feel too sorry for me, or feel sorry for me. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I'm so glad that you're both able to be here because we have some important things to talk about. Empowerment is something that obviously has many facets, and especially in the digital realm. So, let's get into it. So John, my first question is for you. Democracy's promise is that we all have the opportunity to shape policies and programs that impact our lives. What does it take to empower citizens' voices in digital spaces? Is it different?
Interesting. Well, I think there has to be a nexus between the actual engagement and the decision in the final result, and I think that is kind of embedded in the idea of empower. To give people power. I don't know if I see a lot of digital engagement processes really doing that. I think a lot of them feed into existing decision-making processes, so decision makers that are appointed or elected through some other process, a non-digital process, and they take that information into consideration. But I wouldn't call it power. I don't think we're empowering citizens by allowing them to give feedback to elected officials. It's just advice, really. So I think, in order to really empower people, we would have to, and I'm probably going to come back to this theme again in this conversation, is create a nexus, causal linkage between what people say in a digital process and what actually happens. Because at this point, there is really no causal nexus. There's a very discretionary kind of advisory role that citizens are playing.
Thank you for that, John. And I'm excited to get into that, very theme around consultation, where it goes in a little bit. But Amanda, I'd love to get your take. How useful do you think the internet is as a tool for democracy?
Thanks, Victoria. I'd say my thinking on this has evolved over time. I mean, when I first started out as a researcher in this space, I definitely was focused more on this theme of digital democracy and e-democracy, as it was called at the time. And I think, the early research in that space found that a lot of the hopes about the internet sort of bringing forth this new age of democratic empowerment and mass participation, I mean, they didn't pan out in practice, and in part because a lot of the early exercises and initiatives were poorly designed. There was a sense that sort of bigger was better, when in fact, I think we're now comfortable with the idea that engagement doesn't have to necessarily scale to astronomical numbers of participants to be meaningful, and that actually that can be hard to manage in some cases. I think a lot of times, governments, in particular public sector bureaucracies, were not very well set up to engage in informal exchanges with the public online. The fact that the exchanges were kind of had a permanency to them, in as much as they were sort of legible on the web and could be screenshotted or captured and then perhaps used against you in some way in a context of, partisan battles. This was a bit risky and threatening for many governments. So there were lots of things we learned in the beginning. I think where I've shifted to focus now more, when I think about what the internet could do to improve democracy, it really is shifting from questions of sort of decision-making processes, or there's weighty kind of back and forth ideological exchanges, which are for sure very important, but and more towards the public service experience. So for many citizens, their encounters with the state are transactional. It's not, we vote in elections, and from time to time we might participate in a consultation or an engagement, but usually, like when we're interacting with the state, it's to apply for a passport or to register a new child, and it's health care, right? I mean, we've all experienced public services in a very kind of real way in the past few years over the pandemic, whether it was applying for benefits or waiting to get vaccinations, trying to figure out what the new rules were, how you should live your life in order to be safe. So, these kinds of experiences, I think, present a really, really promising avenue for enriching the experience of citizenship. And that feeds back into a very deep literature which identifies a strong connection between a service experience with the state, if it's a positive service experience, it was easy to do, you felt empowered, you felt respected, it made sense, then, you know, trust in government institutions can rise. And that is overall a net gain for democracy. So that's a space that I'm spending a lot of time now focusing on, is how do we improve government services, and then thinking about what that might mean for enriching democracy more broadly.
Thank you, Amanda. And John, I'd love to get your take on some of what Amanda said as well. Maybe we'll start with, you know, the consultation piece. You know, do you find consultation generally well done in public spaces versus, you know, I want to talk to you about your platform as well, but, you know, consultation often gets criticized as a step politicians and public servants take to check a box to say, yes, we engage with community. But oftentimes that feedback goes into a bit of a black box. There's no feedback loop to community. So, you know, what is the difference between true empowerment and traditional consultation as you see it?
Okay, great. Yeah, I have to. By the way, I just want to speak to Amanda, your comment there, because of, you know, so I think there's an important distinction to be drawn between digital democracy and e-government. And I was in Estonia a few years ago, and they have an extremely sophisticated, you know, e-government system where you can do passports and all these things, you know, digitally. They have a citizenship card that has a chip in it. But I don't know if it's necessarily connected to democracy. I think China could have a very effective and efficient e-government system where, you know, there's very little friction in getting your government services. And I suspect they're probably in some ways more advanced than us. You know, they're very digitally oriented already. But and it may even enhance trust in the Chinese government that they're so efficient at delivering these services. But it's certainly not democracy. You know, so I definitely partition the two as kind of almost in different realms, really. In terms of our government consultations good, generally not, I would say. So we work a lot with local governments, and it is a checking the box exercise. And certainly we have our experience with the market, and there's a range of different products that are available for local governments that want to, you know, check that box, do that consultation, ranging from SurveyMonkey, you know, to more sophisticated municipal platforms like Bang the Table. But a lot of it's about data gathering to inform a decision maker. And in a sense, it's consultation, but it's not very democratic because people are not really empowered to play a role in the final decision or even see themselves playing a role in the final decision. It is a black box. And often local government officials are really just going through the motions. You know, they don't even necessarily consider the information, or they may say, oh yes, well, we did our online, and we also got some phone calls, and we've heard some from other people, and we did this round table, and that's all just going into the pot, and we're going to come up with an answer, and it's going to be great. It's all going to be based on your feedback, but really they're just going to do whatever they want, and you know, they're going to find some justification in the data for coming up with that position. It's not, they weren't given clear direction from the public about a course of action. And I think that is what would distinguish a digital democracy from kind of the hodgepodge of, you know, multi-channel consultation that's happening right now, is that it's actually a decision. You know, a decision has been reached by a representative sample of large numbers of citizens, and it's very clear and specific, and now the bureaucrats have to do it. So that is almost completely lacking in our current consultation environment.
Amanda, I'd love to give you a chance to respond to John and a little bit more about the way he's categorized some of his comments.
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely in the, you know, analysis of kind of where government consultation is. I mean, and we've known this for a long time. Like, you know, you can find pre-internet, there were justified complaints about consultation being largely a box ticking exercise. You know, meet with some people, write a what they said report, which may or may not accurately represent what was actually said. And then government's probably going to go forth and do what they wanted to do anyways. And I mean, I suppose like the devil's advocate to all this is to say like, well, you know, we have a system of electoral representation. We vote for our MP, we send them off to Ottawa, and it's perfectly legitimate for governments to make decisions. We don't want to have direct democracy. We don't want to live in a system in which, you know, the policy, you know, complicated policy decisions are made by, you know, people voting en masse on these technocratic questions. But that's definitely a straw man argument that is not helpful in thinking about the kinds of things that I think John is trying to do in his work, and that you know, people who are pushing for more deliberation or more kind of regularized citizen engagement are asking for. I think what we're getting at is that there's a real sense that I mean, we know that decisions made by governments can be greatly improved by bringing in more viewpoints, by getting the perspectives of stakeholders, by understanding in particular kind of the insights of those who experience those policy decisions at their point of implementation. And that's like long been recognized. So there's a very kind of utilitarian argument in favor here, like government decisions will be better if you engage the public more, and not necessarily kind of broad speaking, but it might be more focused engagement with specific relevant communities, which don't have to be experts in a kind of elitist sense, but could be experts in as much as like, you want to understand the experience of being homeless and you want to develop policies that actually help house people, well, then you need to really deeply engage with those communities and understand their lived experience. And so there's that argument, which is just about making better policies that do the job better. But the other side of it is, I think, you know, we've seen countless examples now where, you know, governments are attempting to be more creative and innovative in how they engage the public, moving beyond strictly a typical consultation in which they put up some kind of white paper online and then they ask you to submit, you know, a response into a box, and you don't really know where it goes or what happens, to instead bring people together who have different points of views, force them to engage with alternative perspectives. You know, this can, the benefits go beyond the specific issue at hand, but instead can create a more kind of empathetic, collaborative, and open-minded citizenry, right? So I think we should be excited about that, and we should keep pushing for those kind of innovations. On the point about where public service experiences play into all of this, I mean, I agree completely that we have to be really careful to not take the rhetoric around improving government services and then say that that is somehow stepping in place, that is like a good enough substitute for deep citizen engagement on policy issues, because that's not what it's about. And you can have like a really seamless service experience and high quality digital government services in countries that have like pretty poor human rights records and would otherwise be considered autocracies. And we see this globally, right? There's plenty of countries that we would not really think of as strong democracies that actually have great services. I think what I'm interested in is when the average Canadian, like when they're encountering the state, I think that is an opportunity to sort of socialize them to the idea that the state is sort of not an adversary, for example. And if you are encountering a government form that is confusing, that asks you invasive questions about your personal life or your history that are not even necessary, let's say, to complete the transaction or make it secure, we know from research that people leave those experiences feeling degraded. If the website crashes on you, I mean, imagine in a really real sense, people who were seeking information on vaccines and where they could get vaccinated in a really vulnerable and sometimes terrified moment of their life, living through a pandemic, and they couldn't find the information clearly on a government website. I worry a lot about what that does to people's trust in the state. And I think we can't, so it's necessary, but certainly not sufficient to enrich our democracy. But I get excited when I think of the groups in government today, and there's a kind of global movement afoot in liberal democracies to build better government services. And they're doing that not strictly by slapping technology, but instead by engaging with service users in really meaningful ways, doing very qualitative in-person research with communities who are reliant on government benefits, let's say, and watching them move through a government form, understanding their needs, and then maybe changing language or requirements or making the website more intuitive. And that can be very empowering, I think, especially for vulnerable populations that are really reliant on the state. So it's a piece of the puzzle, but it is by no means some kind of silver bullet.
Thanks, Amanda. I think that you've identified some really important pieces there, like the systems actually working, the language and the purposes being knowable and understanding. And then I think engaging in the process itself. I want to come back to the public conversation in a moment, but John, I'm actually really interested to have you tell us a little bit about Othello and its story and some of the principles behind its creation and how it works.
Sure. So
thank you.
Thanks for the question. I'm talking about this. So essentially, Othello, it's an online, group decision platform, and we have worked with, many local governments across Canada and different kinds of organizations, basically on group decision-making processes. And the way it works is usually with complex decisions. You can take a complicated decision and break it down into components, you might say. There are things, we have options, we have criteria that are going to use to evaluate options, we have some constraints, there's influence that has to be divided across groups. So this is kind of a language you can use to describe a complicated decision. So the Othello platform can take those descriptors and creates a workflow that people can go through and give feedback on all the different pieces. How much do you like this option? What values are important to you, etc. And people can search through a scenario space. In a decision, there might be thousands of possible outcomes, thousands or even millions. So people can give this feedback and identify their particular favorite scenario. For example, the city budget. What's my favorite city budget going to be? And then the algorithm will take that input from all the participants and search through the thousands or millions of scenarios and try to find a specific scenario that has broad support. And when I say broad support, I mean where the average level of support is high and where people are all fairly similar in how much they support things. So this is a very important piece. When you have a majority vote scenario and people are voting for this or that, it's almost always a win-lose outcomes. Some group is going to get what they want and the group is not going to get what they want. And then there's going to be polarization from that point forward. And that's just endemic to our majoritarian interpretation of democracy. It's kind of what we have right now. The way Othello works, by contrast, is it tries to find scenarios where everyone is equally, more or less equally happy, or not even say equally unhappy, but where satisfaction is distributed fairly equitably among the group, even in very polarized groups. We can find sweet spots where scenarios are kind of equally satisfactory to both. And so we call it kind of optimized consensus. And so what it amounts to in total is you can take a very diverse group, very many different opinions, and you can find an outcome that is fair across the group. And why I'm excited by this is because it offers an opportunity to leave behind what I think is a fundamental flaw in our democracy, which is the majoritarian vote system, which leads to divisions and polarization, and is just deeply problematic. So can we move beyond that into a new interpretation of democracy where it's not about where people having equal votes, it's where people have equal satisfaction. And that flip, I think, is one of the things that digital democracy can offer by using kind of sophisticated algorithms.
Thank you for that. And, I think you're right to suggest that when people are part of something, they can be giving feedback throughout an entire consultation, for lack of a better word, there is a greater sense of feeling part of something, of feeling invested in the outcome, and a few other pieces like that. I was also reading a little bit about your EDemocracy Network, and I was hoping you could tell our audience a little bit about that as well.
Interesting. Okay, well, so we have a nonprofit. We actually began as a nonprofit. We have a charity as well, and we do lots of public interest projects, working on climate, etc. But really, the fundamental vision of our organization is to build the kind of technology and human infrastructure for a fundamentally new way of doing democracy, that leaves behind what we have right now. And the EDemocracy Network is an effort to start to lay the foundation for that. And part of it is really a political vision. How can we reboot our current democratic system? And we're working with local governments right now, as you noticed. We're providing the platform there. But I think fundamentally the full reboot will take place when a new kind of political party comes up, one that is not about pandering to the left or the right, but is actually a pan population political party that can do these consultations, make decisions that involve everyone. And if we can create the technology for such a political party to come up, then if it could take elected office, if it could create power for itself, then we could have a reboot of the whole system. And I think that is ultimately what is going to be needed to kind of move past the fundamental problems with this legacy democratic system that we've inherited from the British, from 2 centuries ago, and move into something that can really address the challenges that society is facing right now, climate change, inequality, which were really fundamentally created by our democratic system. Like, these are outgrowths of the way we do democratic decision making. We're not going to solve them using the same democratic decision processes that created them. So we need to level up into a whole other mode. And so that's kind of the ultimate vision of the EDemocracy Network, is laying the foundations for this kind of political movement with the technology tools, with the social components. And now it may take 10 or 20 years, but I think it's going to happen. It has to happen. We can't kind of go on with what we have, or it's going to be disaster.
Thanks very much for that, John, and for explaining it to the rest of our audience as well. Amanda, I'm really interested to get your take on, I read your article about transparency and government services and kind of the doubleness that it can have of increased trust, but also increased anxiety about what to share and to what impact and what outcomes. So I guess more broadly, my question for you is, how does transparency and open data initiatives build trust, but how can it also undermine reflective deliberation and engagement?
Yeah, I like that question.
Good.
So I mean, there's in the past, I guess, well, okay, so open government has a long history, right? Beginning largely with the, access to information or freedom of information laws, which really, kind of gained a lot of steam in the 50s. And the concept has evolved and expanded quite a lot. And in the internet age, it's taken on a whole new range of kind of applications and meanings. So while it traditionally, I think, was framed as this sort of adversarial instrument to hold the government to account, civil society groups, journalists, opposition parties could compel government to give them information in order that they could catch them in corruption or call them out on or arm themselves with information to take them down. The contemporary framing of open government talks a lot more about this being, an instrument for collaborative governance, the push to have proactive disclosure. So governments, working in the open, sharing information as a default, as opposed to being asked to do it in this adversarial us versus them sort of framework, or the open data and the open data piece of it in particular was pushed for a whole bunch of policy reasons, but one being that it would enable more collaboration between the state and non-state actors. So government would release its data in raw, reusable formats, and innovators could create new products, but also that community groups, researchers, the average citizen could delve into government activity, government finances, and sort of better understand how the state works. As with most kind of utopias that are crafted on, it's supposedly going to be driven by the internet. I mean, it was a dream that did not realize in particular. Some of it is just that governments really made promises around open government and didn't deliver. Like, they struggled to get their data and get it out there, or had this parallel track of joining things like the Open Government Partnership, an international group of states committed to open transparency in the state, but then also, tightly managing their communications, not allowing journalists to have interviews with political leaders, or having a broken freedom of information or access to information system, which, like in Canada, for example, it's largely accepted that at the federal level, this just is not working. Takes too long to get a reply. When you do, usually it's heavily redacted. There's lots of problems with the system, and the Access to Information Commissioner writes about this all the time in their reports. So this is like well documented. So what is the relationship then between this effort to open up the state and the average citizen's trust in government? I mean, I don't think that we haven't realized that vision of an open government that inherently, that we haven't realized the vision of an open government. So it's hard to say whether the promise that it might drive trust has panned out, because we haven't quite gotten there yet. There's actually some evidence that at least in the immediate term, the more open a government is, the less people trust it, because you sort of see how the sausage is made. And sometimes it's not very pretty when you actually understand the inner workings of government. I wrote a paper a couple of years ago with a colleague, Elizabeth Dubois at the University of Ottawa, where we looked at a bot that someone had created that would capture public servants' edits to Wikipedia. And this on the one hand seems like a great idea. Public servants are taking time to go to a platform where citizens get much of their information and update the record. And so arguably that's a great example of a government thinking kind of creatively about the internet and a space that they need to participate in as a holder of a lot of useful information. So they should contribute to Wikipedia. But this bot also tweeted, because it automatically tweeted whenever these edits happened. And basically, some of the edits were not really work related, like to a sports team or to a chocolate bar or something like that. And journalists seized on this and they loved it. They thought that it was, a great example of government waste. And so we argue in the paper that, at least the media coverage and internally within government, the managerial response, which was to lock it down and figure out who was editing Wikipedia and punish them, fueled ideas about government being inefficient and wasteful. And who are these public servants who on the public dime are sitting around editing an encyclopedia about chocolate bars? We actually went in and looked at the edits and found that, the majority of them were actually valuable contributions to public knowledge. And so what we tried to do, what we argue in the paper is that, this simplistic line we draw between the more open a government is, the more it engages on the internet, the more people are going to trust it is just that. It's far too simple. In order for government's engagements online and participation in things like crowdsourced encyclopedias, to actually lead to a stronger relationship with citizens, we need a media that is empowered and engaged and has the time and resources, but also I think the journalistic integrity to do its homework when it reports on these things, which wasn't the case in this instance. And we also, I think, need a citizenry that isn't immediately going to jump to the assumption that governments are wasteful, right? So there's a lot of civic education that needs to go into, and I think, and work of media and opposition parties in order for open government to lead to a stronger relationship between citizens. What we often see is that government information disclosures or efforts to participate online and things like Wikipedia actually, I think, fuel perceptions of government as inefficient and wasteful, which would decrease citizen trust in the state.
Thank you for that. I was actually having a very similar conversation last Friday with a friend who's a journalist, and we were actually, having a bit of a debate about the resources required for journalists to tell a whole story, not just a piece of it, like the chocolate bar piece that you were talking about, and then also the responsibility of it as well. Having a headline that serves as good clickbait like that may drive people to a website, which is of course important, but telling the entire story about something as important as a public sector tool or mode for engagement, rather than just undermining it in a headline, is part of the reasons why trusts are undermined, amongst many others. Joan, I want to switch gears a little bit, and I want to ask you about activism. So we see a lot of internet activism, and so I'm just wondering, what are some instances where, or some anecdotes where you may think that people have come together as a group and it's been done well, and how the internet's been leveraged, or digital democracy has been leveraged to create change? And then I have a bit of a part B to that as well. I'm also really interested to hear if there's any examples or case studies from Othello as well, used in a similar pursuit.
So just so I understand, any case studies or work we've done that shows that activism has been positive, or, sorry. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
So basically, yeah, I'd love to hear about kind of two pieces. So one, the idea of kind of activism and digital democracy more broadly, and then specifically within your platform when it comes to collective action, advancing collective action, or any kind of positive interventions as a result of activism.
Yeah, so when I think of activism, I think of kind of issue-based politics, where there's a kind of a position that a group is trying to, advance. So there are certainly digital tools where activist groups that are used by activist groups to kind of pressure politicians, and there are activists that are trying to push for better digital democracy. Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
However,
pets are always welcome.
Pets welcome.
Yeah.
But I don't know if so in my experience, so we have worked with advocacy groups who have done consultation process. We work with the Canadian Diabetes Association, for example, in helping to formulate a new policy framework for healthcare for diabetics. And, sorry, this fellow likes attention.
You might
and
have
we
something
also
to say.
work with Coalition for against Poverty, Disability Without Poverty, and they're also doing a kind of advocacy campaign. Wasn't sponsored by government, but they're hoping to have influence on policymakers. I think I'm not sure the impact that they had ultimately. I think they provided decision makers with good information. I think it was probably fed into the decision-making process. I think activism is not democratic decision-making, because it really is representing just kind of one point of view. I think democratic decision-making is going to be, of representative groups, and there may be a few activists in there promoting the view, but it's going to be a much broader type of consultation process. We certainly have seen and done public consultation processes where activists have tried to influence the results, inappropriately. So we did one around for a city in Ontario where there was the issue of woodlots and trying to preserve the woodlots from being harvested. And the woodlot owners got together, and we could track it because we have some security devices was watching, but they very definitely had a coordinated campaign to try and change the results. And this goes to some of the structural weaknesses in our current systems. We don't have a digital identity system here in Canada, so we can't accurately reliably track whether one person is doing one vote online. You have to go to all these kind of roundabout security measures. So we don't have the infrastructure really for people to participate democratically online. It's just lacking, right? I think until we have something like that, we're going to see attempts like this, and I think this actually really undermines the confidence that public decision makers have in digital consultations. Like this guy, I'm looking after a 1-year-old Maine Coon. I don't know if it has a Maine Coon, but
Well, I feel like now you have to introduce the Maine Coon to everybody since
friendly.
it's becoming a star. Yeah,
and this is 1-year-old, and this guy is huge.
it's beautiful.
Extremely friendly, and doesn't like take no for an answer. So where was I? Sorry, I'm just a little bit distracted there.
No,
but,
all good.
It does undermine public officials' confidence in digital consultation process. And I have come across many local government clients where they say, well, my councillors don't trust it. They got the information, but they just say, oh, it was probably just a community activist group that made this happen, so we don't really trust it. And so until we have more robust identity verification infrastructure, and I know the Canadian government is looking at this, and it may come from the private sector as well, but that is always going to be a problem until we fix that.
Thank you. And so, Amanda, I want to get your take as well, but I'm going to frame it a little bit differently. So obviously we know there's issues related to verification and samples and all those different kinds of things, but how would you say we might balance the positive potential of these platforms that empower civic mobilization, dissemination of news, reaching different kinds of people, and commentary, but also account for anti-democratic forces like censorship, surveillance, and exploitation? Or even, as John was talking about, dismissal as well.
Right. I mean, I suppose off the bat, there's nothing inherently wrong with activist groups, trying. I mean, this is a legitimate tactic for certain kind of issue constituencies to, try to. We've long seen, like letter writing campaigns, and this kind of adversarial approach of like taking over a conversation in order to have like that. That's sort of within the toolkit of a lot of policy advocacy, and I think that's all fine and good. I guess it depends on your objective, and if it's sort of a curated, coordinated, and effort in order to tap ideally a representative sample of the population's perspective, and to do that not through strictly like a polling approach, which you could do. You could hire a polling firm and do that kind of work, but rather to engage in kind of back and forth deliberation and exchange. There's lots of ways that you can get around that, right? I mean, you can structure this as an organized citizens assembly, use a lottery system in order to recruit citizens, bring them to the table virtually or in person, and kind of organize and structure that conversation in a way that leads to productive outcomes, that really prioritizes openness and respect and empathy, and that I think creates space in particular for voices that might otherwise be more quiet or marginalized. I mean, I think one of the things that is a bit of a assumption of a lot of the work that gets done around democratic engagement is this assumption that the average citizen is just eager and ready to participate in these processes, and that's not really true, right? There's many people who are very busy or who otherwise are a bit more shy or introverted. It's not their style to put themselves out there and engage in debate, but we obviously want to hear from those people, because the premise of a robust democracy is that every voice is equal and every voice has an equal opportunity to be heard, and that so I think that's where this effort to create these curated spaces and to kind of coordinate, I think, deliberation become really rich, because you can hopefully bring those voices in, but it takes a lot of work and it doesn't happen spontaneously. And I think the idea that we could just kind of this could just happen naturally online, was deeply problematic, and that's why and especially in an age where we are now, where we know that the kinds of platforms where this might happen online are owned by largely unaccountable social media firms, social media platforms, and technology platforms that I don't think we really want to have their decisions about moderation and inclusion setting the terms for how political debate unfolds. So all that to say, I think that's why we're creating these spaces. It's why firms like Othello exist. It's why other platforms and forms of government-led engagement exist. I'm thinking here of, say, citizens' assemblies that have been run recently in Ireland, or most recently in Canada, the Canadian Commission on Democratic Expression. I mean, these are highly orchestrated, well-funded, well-resourced, planned initiatives. But they have a precedent too, right? We used to do royal commissions in Canada, which were also highly funded, well-coordinated, well-resourced efforts to deliberately move out to the population and engage with their opinions on controversial or high import issues. So we've done this before and we can do it again. And I think this fear that these processes will necessarily be taken over by sort of fringe groups it doesn't actually, I don't think it's as big a risk as maybe some are, as maybe we have, as some presume, right? Yeah, so I think that's kind of my thoughts on how that can play out.
Can I jump in and kind of respond here, Victoria?
Yeah, please go right ahead.
Yeah, so I agree. I think there's lots of things that can be done to enhance the credibility of these processes. It comes down to money. These citizens' assemblies, represent sortition processes. The cost goes up the more valid the process is. SurveyMonkey down here, 2,000 person democratic assembly over here with deliberation and facilitated breakouts, all that kind of thing, and hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of dollars, something like that. The dynamic I see with public officials is, well, these are expensive things, and do I have to do it? Well, I could get by with this, and if I do it, there's all this risk, so much risk. And government officials are very risk averse. And so most of them slide down the curve back to SurveyMonkey, because that's, and there's not a lot of, people. We certainly have customers that do it out of principle. We believe in democracy. We believe in hearing from, unrepresented communities, but they're doing it out of principle. There's nothing in the system that's pushing them to that. There's no mandates. There's no, substantive requirements to do a good job, do good consultation process. It really is just the isolated individuals who really have a firm belief in something that are making it happen, fighting against the headwind of everything, because that's just, it's actually antagonistic to our current systems of power. And we see the same thing in the open data stuff. Well, why isn't this data being released? Well, it's because it's not in the interests of the elected officials to release it at all. Right? They have no interest in being embarrassed in the public forum and being held accountable for things they didn't really understand what's going on anyway. So there's this fundamental structural frictions, and we can have principled people pushing against it. But until we really get underneath the whole system and change how power is distributed away from elections every 4 years, is we're just going to keep on having to fight against kind of very structural institutional barriers. And so no, it's just a fundamental challenge. And that's the reason why I think so little progress has been made, and every step forward has got a step back associated with it as well.
Thank you, John. I want to ask you both a little bit more about the equity piece that we both started to touch on. I'm just wondering, what do you think about those who have been disempowered for a variety of reasons, whether that be due to the digital divide, to isolation, to the inability to really have Canada in a room when we do these kinds of consultations, as opposed to those who are just far more civically engaged? How can we start to approach some of those issues? Amanda, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, so I mean, how do we ensure that it's not just those with the time and resources who participate in these things? So I think one of the things that you need to do is think carefully about design and language in order that it's inclusive. I think also accepting that, in some cases, it might be that you need to get a representative sample of the population for the engagement to be both helpful in terms of the outcomes, but also to for it to be viewed as legitimate. But in other cases, it's perfectly fine to not have a broad segment of the population, strictly speaking, involved in who you're involved in some kind of engagement, right? There's certain policy issues and areas where maybe you need to have a group of stakeholders around the table, and that is enough to get the information you need, and for it to have kind of buy-in from those who are affected, and for it to be viewed as legitimate. I also think that, there's a lot of assumptions, in particular when we move these things online. People will often default to this idea of oh, well, what about the digital divide and those who don't have the internet? And I mean, I think especially in the past few years, we've kind of all realized that while internet access, in particular broadband internet access, is not evenly distributed across the population, in particular, rural and indigenous communities especially don't have necessarily the strongest access to reliable internet. There's also a whole bunch of segments of the population who are better empowered by things moving online, because the transaction cost of participation can go down. I'm thinking here of people who have mobility issues, in the middle of an Ottawa winter, getting to a community hall to participate in some kind of community engagement exercise is just not in the cards for people who have trouble walking, right? They're not going to do that. Or busy families, or single parents, or those who may have multiple jobs. It's difficult to get to these things, right? So there's something to be said about lowering the transaction costs and potentially broadening access there. To me, the big issue is how you identify populations who are typically not involved in these processes, and then how do you reach out to them and encourage them and provide, I guess, a sense of empowerment. And that's where I think probably some of these more orchestrated and well-funded efforts are important, because you can create incentive, and you actually put a lot of work into designing the initiative in order that populations that might not otherwise participate are compelled to participate. So I think the citizens assembly model works really well there, for example, compared to, say, what we tend to see now with a government style of engagement, which is as I mentioned earlier, there's a kind of complicated, dense document put online explaining the government's policy position. There's a website you go to and you type in your thoughts. It takes time, and it's not very accessible in terms of the invitation, even the knowledge that it's happening. And these are the kinds of things that academics and experts and people who are potentially really passionate about the topic and have time are going to spend time in, but most people are not even going to know what's happening. So there's just a lot of it is about design, and I think this is maybe where user research could even be more helpful, is to understand what kinds of cues, what kind of language, what kind of invitations and calls bring people to the table who might not otherwise come. And we've got a lot more work to do in that space, in particular from the public sector angle, in designing these kinds of outreach exercises.
Thank you, Amanda. And John, I'm really excited to get your take as well about, some of the historic inequities that we see, but then also some that are the ultimate outgrowth out of digital. And then I guess the part B to that is, I'm really interested to hear about how some of your thoughts flow into Othello, and how you see your own platform evolving in time to grow its own reach and efficacy and equity as well.
Yeah, sure. So we're often retained to recruit representative samples. So, a city wants to do a budgeting process, but they want to have a 1,000 person sample. So one of our services, we do multi-channel marketing, social media ads, mail drops, dial outs, monitoring the demographic profile of the participants and trying to ensure representativeness. Oh, it's expensive. And, you have to appeal to people's better natures, often in different ways, depending upon the natures of the subgroup that you're looking at. So, I'm talking also about kind of tailored, targeted media marketing strategies as well. But I think there's kind of a fundamental problem, really, in that if someone's going to come and give up their time, half an hour, 45 minutes, a few hours, it really is a transaction. Like, they're giving their time. What are they getting back? So you can pay people in two ways. One, you can give them power. So they can have a sense that, well, my input is actually going to move the dial somehow on the final decision. And government is totally falling down on this transaction. This is what people don't trust. It's
Agreed.
like, well, I can put my feedback in there, but just as far as I know, it's going to get thrown in the garbage. Even in elections, people try to persuade me that if I go down and spend my day in the voting line, that's something I should do, and it's actually a good use of my time. But most people can do the math. It's like, well, I didn't make any difference in that election. In fact, the person I voted for didn't get elected at all, and now it's a day gone. Most people can do this calculation, and they're like, yeah, I'm not persuaded. And it's kind of a rational choice. And I think the other thing is, so it ties into this, money is time. Like, people, we have huge participation from retirees, right? People, or upper class people that have their evenings free and their weekends free, and they can spend a couple hours kind of engaging in the intellectual play of policy debate. But other people are single moms with 2 kids trying to hold down 2 jobs, and like, what are you talking about? I don't have 15 minutes to eat, right?
Exactly.
So these people are structurally non-participation, and you have to try extra hard to get them out. But the solution is, I think, you just pay people. You have to pay people. If democratic participation is worth something, you pay for it. And the lack of our current system to kind of acknowledge that, democratic participation has an economic value. We should pay not only for the process, but also for people's time, so that they're not set back. I think that's it has to happen, right? We should even be paying people to go and vote. So, what we're doing about it, this is tied into this EDemocracy Network I mentioned before, and we're now moving into Web3. So we're working with, I don't know if people know about Web3, but it's kind of a new kind of internet that's based on blockchain technology, and cryptocurrencies are quite integrated into it. But it's not, speculation on what tomorrow's Bitcoin price is going to be. It's really about micropayments to people for different kinds of services. That's kind of where we are in that space. And so the next generation of our platform is going to incorporate payment systems for people that participate, and on gradients. There's just the payment for just being a participant, but there's also payments for great participation, or being an influencer, or someone that trusts you and has delegated their influence to you. So I think the gamification of democratic participation and the tokenization, the reward structures are going to be very important to come up with something that is actually not just accessible, but that people feel motivated to participate in. And
they actually feel.
Yeah, sorry, go
ahead. Yeah, no, I was just going to say, they actually feel engaged to do it. I actually work in big data myself, and see that the gamification of how people are being taught things in academia are like ways to engage students. But anyway, I could talk about that all day. We actually have a couple. Yeah, I was going to say. Oh, sorry, go ahead, John.
Jump in here as the timekeeper, knowing that we're coming up on 2 o'clock. I just want to check in with John and Amanda. If we run 5 minutes over, I know we have some questions from the audience. So, are you okay if we run 5 minutes over? Okay, great.
Amazing.
So I'm buying us a little time here for the questions. This is an amazing conversation.
Thanks, John. And that's the thing. I wish we had so much longer, but maybe we'll try to do the questions in a bit of a lightning round if you guys will permit us to do that. And because I know John has an important announcement to make at the end. So the first question comes in from Flavia. If we think that the internet does more good than bad to strengthen democracy, how should we deal with the radicalism that is also flourishing with the internet? Who should be in charge with dealing with this radicalism if governments themselves benefit from it? Amanda, do you want to take that one? And to give the example of Bolsonaro in Brazil, just so you have an understanding of some of the specificity Flavia is talking about. But anyway, please go on.
Yeah. I mean, I think that this is the kind of premise of the conversation today, right? Is that I think broadly speaking, most people, when we think of the effect that the internet has had on democracy, we jump right to these kind of more concerning outcomes, the rise of illiberal states, the kind of reality of mis and disinformation, of targeted harassment campaigns, of like foreign interference in elections. I mean, there's plenty of ways that the internet is currently eroding our democracy and eroding the quality of democratic exchange and dialogue. So who should deal with that? I mean, I'm a fan of the movement that we're starting to see in certain jurisdictions to implement deep regulation and control over the social media platforms that to date have largely been able to run without much oversight and regulation and have allowed these sorts of problems to flourish. So I think, of course, the question is what happens in states where we don't trust the government. And I mean, where you have a kind of an illiberal state in place and a political leader that isn't viewed as legitimate. I mean, that's, yeah, I don't think you're going to see strong regulation of these platforms coming, or the kind of regulation that you're looking for. But we can look to the European Union's doing a lot of aggressive work in this space. The legislation they're putting forward isn't perfect, but I mean, it's a bold kind of, I think, and courageous willingness of legislators to say, look, like we need to get back control of this platform and try to put in place laws around things like antitrust, in some cases regulating speech, but also concerns around kind of citizen ownership of their data, and basically like try to turn the internet back to something that can be broadly a force for good, and where there's more kind of public control and ownership. So that's a long answer to say that state regulation is the answer here.
Thank you so much, Amanda. John, I'm going to direct this one to you. So this is coming from James. The observation that concerns me most is how our system has morphed into a party leader dictated system. We have normalized that disagreement with your party leader leads to exile. The only solutions I see are to increase independent candidates and to advocate for proportional representation. Would you agree, and what are your thoughts?
I wouldn't agree that it's the only answer. I think proportional representation is a step along the way. I mean, we are seeing the evolution of the political party system into kind of almost a natural outcome, and it's increasing centralization of power and kind of, this is kind of where these things go. So, and my mind just went blank, unfortunately, but can you bring me back? Sorry.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Don't worry about it. It was like lots of questions into one. So people were saying, James was saying that, there aren't ways to really disagree with your party. Once you're within it, it leads to exile, and that he thinks some solutions would be to see increased independent candidates and some other things like that.
I think it's a midway point, proportional representation. I actually was, quite involved with proportional representation campaigns, kind of in earlier part, but I think if we're going to go part way, why not go the whole way? Proportional representation still has elections every 4 years. It still has, unaccountability once they're elected. Like, it does some things that are improvements, but it doesn't get us where we really need to go. And so, I think much more radical transformation is needed than that.
Okay, well, maybe you can come back for another episode with us to talk about some of those radical transformations. Maybe you both can, and that would be wonderful. So I want to say thank you so much for the conversation today. I'm just going to hand things over to John Beebe to also issue some thanks and to close us out. But it was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Clearly, this is a conversation we need to continue somehow in 45 minutes, 50 minutes here of conversation. We were not able to solve all the problems that we face with democracy and our internet, but what I really appreciated was both your groundings in the work, sort of your willingness to ask and sort of force the tough questions and deal with some of the maybe sort of naive assumptions that have been held around the potential of the internet for this work. But also somehow you both are able to clearly hold some hope that there is a way forward for the promise both of democracy, writ large, and how we can use this tool for some positive engagement that, as John, you were saying at the very beginning, that really genuinely empowers people, because that really is ultimately the promise of democracy, is that people have power over their lives and are able to impact the decisions that impact their lives, whether it's, how do I get my passport, or, how do we address climate change and systemic racism? I mean, that's, and, at the exchange here, that's at the heart of our work as well, is how do we empower people to make changes in their lives that are meaningful to them? And that is not an easy task, never has been. There's not a lot of actual precedent for success in that. And so that's the struggle we're up against. And that's sort of what came out of the conversation today. So I really appreciate the depth of insights you brought to the conversation, and beginning that, and look forward to continuing that as we move forward. For those of you who have joined us today, I hope you'll join us again on October 4th, because in Ontario, and actually in Vancouver and BC as well, there are municipal elections coming up. And municipal elections in some ways are those that are most closely connected to the things that impact us every day. And they're also where we know that people engage the least. So we're going to look at this dilemma with Andrea Reimer and exciting guests to think about how can we reinvigorate our municipal politics and our municipal democracy. So join us then. If you don't already, please sign up for our newsletter. It's engagedemocracy.ca for more information about the work we're doing. We have toolkits and other resources available to engage in the upcoming election. So please follow us there, or follow us on Twitter. I got to keep plugging those pieces. I remind, and Ashley has put those up in the chat there to make it easy for everyone. And with that, I will sign us off, and really appreciate again everyone taking the time to join today, because as John said, time is money. It's time. Your commitment of time is the most valuable asset you have, and everyone who's been here today, that's what you're giving here to this work. So we really appreciate you being here with us. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.